ego is the soul's worst enemy. Whoever you are, whatever you are doing, your worst enemy is your ego. One of the biggest reasons why the ego is your opponent is because it prevents you from connecting with reality. Your arrogance is what restricts you from getting essential feedback from others. Ego makes you excessively estimate your strengths and significance and underestimate the importance of others' perspectives and contributions. It blinds you to your own flaws and limitations, hindering personal growth and inhibiting genuine connections with others. In essence, ego distorts your perception of reality. Your ego is the sum of your experiences. All it wants to do is protect you, but that isn't always best for you in the long run. What we fear doing most is usually what we most need to do. Your ego is a master of manipulation. Instead of succumbing to its fears and getting stuck, become aware of how it holds you back. Then, you can set yourself free and live the life you truly want. Your ego would rather win than do the right thing.
The ego is a tricky little sucker. And within our human psyche, it's pretty much been built in. And although some of us identify with it more than others, what good is it really doing us? In this video, we're going to explore exactly what the ego is. The more knowledge we have, the better equipped we'll be when circumstances of the ego arise. Let's get into it.
So let's understand, what is ego. When you say I am ... anything that comes after the I am ... is part of your ego. Anything on your resume is part of your ego. So ego is a construct. It is not actually who you are or what you are. So I can say that I am a doctor, but that is not a real thing. You can't biopsy me and find a doctor. You can't x-ray me and find a doctor. I was me before I was a doctor, and I'm me after I was a doctor. So how can being a doctor be a part of who I truly am? What it is a part of ego, right? It is a construction that I wrap around myself. And the really interesting thing about this is once you discover that I'm not really a doctor, I wasn't born a doctor, and it has value, don't get me wrong. So the ego serves a purpose, but it's not truly who you are. So then the question becomes, okay, well, who am I? And the cool thing about that is if anything that is related to ego is not who you are, it's incredibly liberating.
I really love his explanation of ego and the role that it plays. I don't want to villainize the ego because I do believe that it serves a purpose in this physical 3D reality, this human experience that we're having as spiritual beings. However, I think that we do get entirely too wrapped up in the character and ultimately pulled away from our true nature. And it's quite easy to do so when getting wrapped up in our character leads to things like void filling and validation, which ultimately stems from deep-rooted wounds that we avoid facing and looking at. And that's why I think it's so detrimental for anyone who wraps their identity around the character, because as soon as this construct is deconstructed, it can be massively disruptive to the sense of self, which is why people were jumping off of buildings during the stock market crash back in the day. And it's the reason why so many people fall into a depression when their marriage or their relationship with another dissolves. It's because so much of the identity of who we are is wrapped up in the character, in the ego. And so I think it's really important that we keep an eye on our ego and become extremely mindful, aware, and conscious of where our focus and attention is on a moment-by-moment basis. Let's keep going.
And I need you to understand what the ego does. It does two things. The ego will soothe and shield. The ego will soothe and shield. In other words, it will shield by repelling, saying, no, man, that person's wrong. Their criticism, their feedback is inaccurate. It's a shield. An ego will create this glass shield, not allowing you to take in criticism and feedback that can make you a better human. The ego is also something that will soothe you. Oh no, I'm a better person than that. They don't know what they're talking about. I'm a much better person than that. I'm kind, I'm compassionate, I'm empathetic. So you end up having all this really gentle and soft, soothing conversations with yourself, even though people around you are saying the contrary. So the ego does create blind spots.
What's up, y'all? Welcome back to the channel. I'm your host, Amanda Haynes. If you haven't already, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you'd like, go ahead and subscribe if you like the vibe and would like to join the tribe. Ultimately, I think the ego is the blind spot. The one thing about the ego is it completely blanks us out of the scenario. And I've said this time and time again. When you revisit a memory of maybe being in an argument with someone, most of us don't actually picture ourselves in that memory. Most of us only see the other person and remember the argument however our memory serves us. And this is how the ego blanks you out. It completely takes you out of the picture, which ultimately throws us into victimhood because we can't possibly see the role that we play from the standpoint that we're in, from physically not being able to see our perspective in situations. Ultimately, we're blinded by the belief systems the ego holds. We don't actually see reality as it is. We see reality as we are. And so in this way, I don't know if identifying with our ego is really helpful for us.
It's enslaved thinking. It's thinking that's a slave to your own ego. You're not free thinking when your ego is pulling the strings. When your ego is the one that's like manipulating the conversation. Ego is tricky. Ego is a tricky thing. You know what I mean? It's
Yes.
like it is sneaky, it's smart, it's deceptive.
Where's the lie? He's dropping gems. The ego is tricky. The attachment to the ego is what manipulates. It's these thoughts are coming in and I'm attaching to and believing them. Because we have to remember we are the ultimate authority of our being. And when I say ultimate authority, we were endowed with free will. Now, whether or not we're practicing our free will is determined by who's running the show here. Is it the authority that was given to me, the one that decides, or is it the ego, the thoughts that are coming in? You know, it's possible to have thoughts and not react to them. But when we're going through our day, completely lacking mindfulness and consciousness, we are just following our thoughts like a puppet and we're not practicing our sovereignty. Here's a really good example. Say you want to lose weight and your inner authority, your true nature, has made the decision that we're going to go on a diet. And a thought comes in that says, I'd like a piece of cake. We have the ability to allow that thought to pass by like a cloud and to stand in the sovereignty of the decision that we've made. But it's so easy to get wrapped up in our thoughts and to act upon them in a way that goes against the original commitment that we made. So it's a tricky thing. And it really, I think, takes consciousness and awareness of who's running the show here, who's having these feelings, who's having these thoughts, who's upset right now. Let's keep going.
Ego is a Latin word for I. That's all it means. The ego means I. In other words, the ego, you and me, is the individualistic I, me, mine, separate from you, separate from others. The ego. The ego is a false sense of self. It's a false sense of self because it's your self based on labels other people painted on you. So you form an identity based on all this labeling, but because that labeling isn't who you really are underneath it all, because your core identity is your soul, these labels create a false sense of self and identity, and then the job of the ego all of your life is to protect it. This is why the ego loves attention, but it hates scrutiny.
Now, is our core identity our soul, or is our core identity spirit? It's such an interesting construct when you really think about it. If the fabric of who we are comes from God, and essentially God split itself into spirit and souls and persons and rocks and trees and all these things, if everything is God, then isn't that our true identity, our core identity? I'm just throwing that out there. So the ego is it's who I think I am, right? I think my name is Amanda. I think I'm a YouTuber. mother, a content creator. I think I'm a daughter. I think I'm a girlfriend. I think I'm a former nurse. There's all of these things that we identify with in this human experience that we believe is who we are. But the thing is anything that can be changed, because I can easily change my name. I can easily relocate from where I live. I can easily change my profession. My parents will transition. All of these things that I identify with are changeable. So what about that makes me who I am? I really like how he said a false sense of self. I think that there's only one way to come to know who you truly are, and that's through self-realization. Now, how you get to that point is infinite, whether it's through meditation, psychedelics, a near-death experience, ultimately leads you to come to know who you are and who you are not. But when we live in this egocentric bubble or this egocentric mindset, we can't fathom ourselves to be any more than this character we've created, or ultimately that our parents created or that society created. The ego is very tricky. Let's keep going.
The ego is the most dangerous part of us. Ego is the enemy. The ego. You have to have a little bit of it to keep moving. But you let that get out of control, then you have the power freak. You see them in the papers every day. The corruptness of corporations, the greed, the power, the belief that they're gods.
I like how he said it's necessary to keep us moving forward. Okay, if we really think about this, if we didn't have an ego in this experience, what would we wear? How would we dress ourselves? How would we show up in public? How would we present ourselves to others? What would we call ourselves, right? So ego, I think, plays a role in this experience, but I think we've become too attached to the role that it plays, to the point that we're identifying with it. And that is where I think it gets us in trouble. Let's hear what someone else has to say.
So the ego, then the essence of ego, you could say is complete identification with thoughts. So, and the recurring thoughts in your mind that tell you who you are, that's the ego. So waking up means to suddenly recognize that the thoughts that go through your head continuously, but also the emotions that reflect those thoughts, are not who you are. Recognize that certain thoughts are continuously arising in your mind, and you, for a moment, you have stepped out of that, and you recognize it's a stepping back, one could say, or before your consciousness, one could say, was completely absorbed by these continuously arising thought forms. And you know how it is when people are in the grip of the stream of thinking. You're hardly aware of your surroundings, and everything you see is you interpret through the screen of the conditioned mind, which is the ego. It's a very, and this entity is ultimately a fiction.
This entity, right? This entity of who we are, who we think we are, is fiction. It's not real. It's not who we are. It's just a character we play. It's just a mask we wear in this experience, but it's not real. I like how he talks about getting wrapped up, your consciousness getting wrapped up in this stream of thoughts. You can really recognize the magnitude of how this happens when you think about daydreaming or stepping into meditation. When you sit down in darkness and silence and stillness, you get to really see how chaotic the mind is. But so much of our experience is full of distraction that it just becomes a part of the noise. And then we identify with it. We hop on these thought trains and we get completely lost. We get completely taken out of the present moment. We immediately go unconscious. And it's the ego that takes us there. He described a really great way of staying mindful and conscious of the mind and its chatter. Sitting in the back seat of a car that you're driving. Sounds super scary, right? Because it's like, who's on the wheel? Well, in this case, we're going to say Jesus. Okay, Jesus took the wheel and you're in the back seat and you're safe and secure, but you're viewing this from a different perspective, from a perspective that is a little further away from the character that you think you are. And viewing your thoughts like essentially riding in the back seat is a way for you to not attach to them. It's a way for you to see them for what they are. It's honestly a really great metaphor. It's a great example he gave. I love him too. He actually was the catalyst to my spiritual awakening. And if you haven't already, go ahead and check out my video, What It Feels Like to Have a Spiritual Awakening, where I talk about what a spiritual awakening is and what it's like for a lot of people. Let's keep going.
I'm going to give you 3 signs to let you know that the ego is ruling your life. Number 1, you're constantly comparing yourself to somebody else. Okay? Only the ego has to be above or below someone else. That's number 1. Number 2, you are obsessed with your physical body and you really think that you're your body. The ego attaches itself to this physical reality and creates all of these physical identities to keep you trapped in this physical 3D reality. Number 3, you think that other people are separate from you. This was the main goal of the ego, to create separation. We can look at the Bible and see the personification of the ego through Satan, or as they would say in Hebrew, Hasatan, which means the deceiver, the adversary. This is what keeps you from seeing that we are all the same, that we are all connected, that no one is actually different and everybody was just a projection of you.
Well, there you have it. That's a hell of a perspective. It's interesting because the Bible can be interpreted in lots of different ways. You can have literal interpretations, spiritual interpretations, metaphysical interpretations. And the interpretation he's referring to is that the devil is personified as the ego. And that really the game of life is an internal one. That's why they call it the universe. You get it? I remember when I thought I was a body long ago. If ego means I, then everyone is individual. But it's such a false representation of this experience. And the less and less that you identify with the ego, the more and more you're able to see that. Let's keep going.
Because once you have entered into the path of truth, you can no longer deceive yourself. You can no longer pretend that life is about family or career, or making money, or looking good, or having some fame, fortune, or financial security, or any of the other goals that recruit the ego to serve the system. Have you attained independence from that collective ego system so that its false values do not dominate your consciousness and cause you to betray yourself and remain ignorant of your true nature, your true power, your true capacity to love, to create, to transform?
I just love that video. And I wonder if this sparked an egoic uprising in anyone. Life not being about family or money or financial security. All of those aspects throw the ego way the hell off because it's the ego's job to protect. It's the ego's job to protect itself, the character. So hearing that these things aren't what life is about and then experiencing some sort of upset about that means that there is some attachment to these constructs that the ego doesn't want to let go of. The ego is tricky and sly and sneaky, and it will have you out here whole ass believing that you are this character construct, this false sense of self for an entire lifetime and lifetimes over. But all of this is just food for thought. We all have this inner guru inside of us where each of our truths exist. And I highly recommend you go find your own truth. So that's pretty much all that I have for y'all today. Drop a comment below. I want to hear about what your perspective is on this interesting topic. Where do you stand on the ego and its importance in this lifetime? If you haven't already, go ahead and like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who would appreciate some perspective. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.